Ladies and gentlemen, this is David Mirikitani with another episode of Matt Chat, brought to you by USA Wrestling, the national governing body for wrestling in the United States, and by Nike Wrestling. Go to athleteps.com for all of your Nike and USA Wrestling branded gear. Joined today by the 2025-26 future head coach and the associate head coach of your Penn Quakers, Matt Valenti, who didn't want me to mention that he was a two-time NCAA champion. Matt, how are you, man? Thank you for coming on.
I'm doing great, David. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to jump on here with you.
Of course. I think I'm like a lot of people in the wrestling world where you follow people you respect or you feel like know things or have intelligent takes or opinions on social media. And one of the things I learned in this job is don't be scared to text, email, DM somebody. And I saw your posts about what's going on with NIL, with NLI, with roster caps. And I think most of the people that watch my podcast know I'm a finance major. You mentioned to me off the air, you've worked 10 years in administration at UPenn. So I think we come at it maybe from a different perspective. And my goal of this podcast is to help people understand better what's actually happening, maybe delve into why it's happening, and point out possible outcomes and maybe a solution or two. So that's a pretty heavy lift in an hour, but we'll see what we can get done. So let's just start out with your posts, and maybe take however long you need to just kind of summarize your observation of things.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. And let me start by saying, as much as I have a decent understanding, I'm by no means an expert in this. And a lot of what I shared in my post and a lot of what I've talked about is just a little bit of like what I suspect will happen based on what we're learning as this kind of moves forward, and a little bit of my background of kind of being in a different seat outside of wrestling for a little while, and kind of putting those pieces together as we look towards the future. So for those who haven't been following closely, the NCAA in general is perpetually being sued for a variety of things. Going back a few years, one of the big moment breakthroughs was allowing student athletes to earn money off of their name, image, and likeness, NIL, right? Which I think was a big breakthrough in a positive way for student athletes, which is great. And we see, that kind of in process, in action right now. It's depending on who you talk to, it might be totally out of control or, totally reasonable. But I think that was the first big step in kind of the lawsuits that happened with the NCAA. But the one that everybody's kind of been keeping an eye on is this House versus NCAA. So this lawsuit is one that was brought by a former swimmer from Arizona State, which is somewhat ironic when we talk about the fallout of this lawsuit, or potential fallout of this lawsuit that has been in the works for years now. And the core of this lawsuit is essentially around revenue sharing for college athletes. So everybody sees the big numbers around college sports, TV contracts, sold out football stadiums, all of those things. See all these big dollars that are being created in revenue. And that is undeniable that revenue 100% exists out there. The House lawsuit is that student athletes should be entitled to a piece of that pie. And that has really started to take shape. That lawsuit has moved forward. There's been an outcome that's being kind of finalized, and we're getting through the details of what it's going to look like. But alongside the revenue sharing piece of it, there's also pieces of it that have really started to kind of develop over the last few months now that are around scholarship limits, and namely scholarship limits essentially going away, with the additional part of that being they'll put a roster cap on teams as well. So the scholarship limits go away, but there's a roster cap, but that means anybody on a roster can receive a scholarship in addition to the revenue share that's already going into place. And then the other piece of this that's being discussed that's not quite finalized yet is a salary cap as well, right? So that's a salary cap for an athletic department collectively, or schools collectively, TBD on exactly what that's going to look like. But all of these things come out in a way that paint a picture of more money being needed for college sports, and at the same time a cap on the amount of money that's needed for college sports, right? And so what does that mean, and what does that look like What my post kind of talks about is, at least in the current model, as things somewhat exist, a lot of that money we can probably safely expect will go back to the big sports, right? Football, men's and women's basketball, namely being those big sports, if you will. Then you need to think about the equity side of things, because we do still have Title IX to think about and appropriately make sure that women's sports are being taken care of in all of this. So now we start to add all these layers in. And when you start looking at that, the first flags that really start to go up are around men's sports and men's Olympic sports specifically. But then really any women's sports, Olympic women's sports in particular, that either may not bring in revenue or don't have significant rosters to balance out the equity side of things. So you introduce all these variables that I would say kind of put us in a weird place, that we don't know what the future of this is going to look like. We know there's a lot more money needed, mostly for those big time sports, the big name sports. We know there's a finite amount of money to go around. And we know that there may be a salary cap coming that may also limit how much money can come in collectively. So that money needs to be moved and prioritized in different ways, right? So those are the things that we kind of know are coming into place here. And then kind of as we look forward, the scariest thing to me in all of this is that this is going into place in 25, 26. So we are 9 months away from this being in place. And there's no clear answer yet of exactly how this is going to play out. But I think we're starting to see bits and pieces of how athletic departments are going to handle this. Namely, those examples being Ohio State and their men's gymnastics program, and then everything happening at Campbell for our wrestling community that's specific to Campbell wrestling. But if you look, it happened to multiple sports at Campbell as well. So where exactly this goes, we don't necessarily know yet. But I will say there are plenty of bright yellow and red flags going up that I think we all need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, it's a great job of laying it out. And I kind of took some notes as you were talking. So I'm going to try to add for the audience maybe a little more layers. Some of these are facts and some of these are opinions, frankly. Mm-hmm. So the first thing is the NCAA is basically and whatever in court. They've never won a court case. So they kind of know by now it's way better to settle than to try to win, because when they've tried to win, they've lost more and paid legal fees. The second thing is, just for people who don't follow this real closely, there's a difference between NIL, name, image, likeness, NLI, National Letter of Intent. And the National Letter of Intent has basically, I think, been legislated to go away now, because they've also said you can do multiple transfers. It used to be there was all these transfer rules and coaches could prevent you from going to certain schools or not at all. Now you can go to 4 schools in 4 years, as long as you stay on your academic progression rate. So that's a big thing. This one's strictly an opinion, but I feel like when NIL opened, the analogy I made, it was kind of like letting a waiter or a waitress keep their own tips. Like the school wasn't giving them any money. They were already doing the work and somebody wanted to pay them. So that's what they did. Only it's a lot. In some cases, it's a lot of money. In some cases, it's just a little bit extra, but it really wasn't like the schools are being generous. They were just letting, like, I look at like the Johnny Manziel 30 for 30, and what he got in trouble for now is encouraged. It's almost like arrest for marijuana versus then and now too. Like now it's legal and all this other stuff. I want to get more into the salary cap and roster caps, but the other thing I think it's important for wrestling people to understand is we have a lot of people in the wrestling world that are very comfortable siding between being socialist and capitalist, depending on which ones they feel is more beneficial to them. Like, and if you're only watching this, Matt is nodding. So what I mean by that is, when we talk about football and men's basketball, we want to be socialist and we want to share in that wealth. But then if it comes down to like the bowling team or gymnastics or lacrosse, we're like, well, those guys aren't generating any money. Why should we give them any of ours? And it's hypocritical. It's also normal. We're inherently selfish creatures, and we all want what's best for ourselves and the people we love. But you can't be on both sides of that fence and really have any credibility. Like, you either are a capitalist and you understand you got to generate your own money, or you're a socialist and I don't want to give my opinion that that's a whole different set of how this works. And then you have to convince people that have more money than you do to share with you. And that's intrinsically a very difficult idea. So the other thing that I think is interesting that a lot of people may not know is like the football schools, the bowl game money is actually not shared with the NCAA at all. The NCAA's big money makers, the NCAA basketball tournament TV contract. And when all this was happening a couple of years ago, I looked up how long that contract goes out. And it goes out all the way to like 2030 something. And they will renew it in 2028 till 2040 something, because if they don't and it expires, the NCAA probably goes away, because there's really not, I mean, nobody's really regulating any things. Like, I got recruited by Roger Reina and Penn back in 1988. So I love that school and would have been an honor to go there. So I pick any school in the world, pick Mirikitani University. If we're cheating a little bit, nobody's really checking, because they don't really care, especially in wrestling. Like, they just don't care. They care about staying out of the news and not getting sued and all this other stuff. So we think there's this regulatory body which has a gazillion vice presidents all making between $200,000 and $400,000 a year, and they're making it off the backs of the NCAA basketball tournament. Some of that is opinion. In fact, it's all the opinion of David Mirikitani and not that of USA Wrestling. So I should give that disclaimer. So, but I feel like I'm a business major, and like I feel like I think I'm on pretty sound ground when I say that. The roster cap one, let's talk about that for a minute, Matt. So like I looked at a school right now, and they have 34 kids on the roster, okay? And they have 6 kids that I believe are going to graduate. It's hard to tell with these COVID years, but let's say I'm right for the time being. And they've signed 9 kids, or they have 9 verbals that will sign in November, okay? So next year, they're going to have 37 kids. So they're going to have to cut 9 guys. Their cap is 30. So I think what you're going to see is a redistribution of wealth and assets. Like, you're still going to see like the Iowas and Penn States and Oklahoma States sort of cherry picking from other schools, but then their bottom guys are going to come out, and they can't just keep them all on the roster. Even if they want to, they can't. And those schools are going to end up going to like the South Dakota States. And I use them as an example because of what happened with Glazer and Siebrecht. I don't even know how the Ivies fit into this, and I'm super interested in your qualified opinion on that. But I also think a lot of these schools are just going to tell these kids are all on the roster till like August 15th. They're going to tell 37 kids they're on the roster, and they're really only going to keep 28 of them because they're going to keep their finger in the portal and keep a slot or 2 open for that. So your thoughts on the roster cap and how it might affect things, in either if you think I might be onto something or if you see it totally differently.
So yeah, I would say, David, you're definitely onto something. So here's what we know, and you talk about fact versus opinion, which I think is great. Here's what we know is fact coming out of the House settlement at this point. There will be roster caps, and within the roster caps, there will be no scholarship limit. So anybody who fits within that roster cap can be on scholarship. So we know those 2 things. We also know that schools will have the option to opt in or opt out of the House settlement kind of piece of this, right? This new model that we're looking at. We don't know for sure yet. I would say we're probably 95% of the way there. But the Ivy League specifically, we will opt out of this. We will not be involved in this. And I chuckle a little bit. You know, I put this post out there, and the irony of me putting this post out there is, from my perspective, I'm mildly concerned about this. But in the biggest picture, this really doesn't impact us. We're non-scholarship. We're need-based financial aid only. We're not going to opt into the House settlement, most likely. We're not going to have a roster cap as a result, right? So if I have 39 guys that are full need financial aid, so be it. Doesn't faze me, right? So that's actually, from our perspective, we actually view that as a potential positive, right? And you talked about the fallout of the roster cap. And interrupt
you real quick, but you won't have a roster cap. Like, that was the other thing, was like, back like when I was friends with the Division I coach, and we were talking about how if you didn't have a certain academic progression rate, like you could get suspended and stuff. And I explained to them, I'm like, the Ivy Leagues, all their guys are on track because they're all smart kids. But even if they have a couple kids flake out, it doesn't matter, because that only ties to scholarship athletes, and they don't have any scholarship athletes.
Correct.
Yeah.
So the House settlement and the scholarship limits are somewhat irrelevant to the Ivies, right? And the service academies as well. I'll put them in the same category. But anybody who's a scholarship school, what will be interesting to see is if it's going to be decisions made at a conference level or at a school level, or whether they opt in or opt out. We know that the Power Four conferences, the Big Ten, the Big 12, the ACC, and the SEC, will opt into this. They don't really have a choice. So if you're a school in that conference, you're in.
They have to opt in. All these schools have to opt in.
In the Power Four, for sure. Yes, that seems like that is a done deal at this point.
And just to clarify, like, for example, in the big SEC, we'll use that school like Missouri and Oklahoma are SEC schools that wrestle in the Big 12 as affiliates. Then take the Big 12. There's schools that wrestle in the Big 12 that are not really Big 12 schools. Like take a Wyoming, they're an affiliate. So Wyoming doesn't have to opt in because they're not really a Big 12 school, correct?
They haven't crossed the bridge into affiliate members yet. Right. So that's going to be one of the pieces that we don't necessarily know the answer to yet, but we'll have to see how they play out. Will the Big 12 wrestling conference be comfortable with some schools having opted in and some schools having opted out? Or will they say, hey, if you want to stay in the Big 12, you have to opt in? That we don't necessarily know yet.
And that's interesting because if they, like, let's say I just pick Wyoming because, you know, I know that program. I know Mark Branch and company. And if they say, well, look, we can't opt in, like we don't have, this doesn't work for us economically, which I'm going to ask you about next, the economics of the in and out. But if they say we're not going to do that, then those schools, all those affiliate schools probably have to go form their own wrestling conference.
Potentially, yes. And then it'll be interesting to see, like, are you going to be able to combine schools that opt in and don't opt in? Right.
It feels like it's literally the haves and have-nots. Like all the opt-outs would be, and I'm not saying any of these schools would opt out, but like a Cal State Bakersfield and Wyoming and South Dakota State and a North Dakota State and a Northern Iowa and these kind of schools, Air Force for sure, because there's nothing for them to opt in or out to. Okay, so go on. I apologize for interrupting you.
No, all good. All good. No, I think you're absolutely on the right track. And this is where so many of these variables and questions come into play right now. Because remember, all of these schools, the Wyomings, the Bakersfields, the Oregon States, like schools that don't necessarily have a true conference home with the wrestling conference that they're in. They have a different conference that they're a part of. They may be stuck with whatever decision that conference makes. Right, which may be different than the wrestling conference. So there'll be some moving parts that we'll have to figure out. But to your thought and opinion around kind of rosters and how they play out. So if we just focus on the Power Four, that we know what's going to happen with those Power Four from a roster and scholarship standpoint. All right, so Power Four schools are all going to opt in. Right, they will all have the opportunity to go to, if it ends up being 30 scholarships. Right, but we also know they're capped at a 30 roster as well.
So that, okay, thank you. The cap of 30 is a firm number. How many each of these scholarships, each of these schools choose to assign to certain sports is TBD. And it's based on proportionality from what I understand. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And football is going to bump from 85 to 105. So then they have to come up, let's say the population is exactly 50-50 men to women at the university. They have to start with 105 women's scholarships first to balance out football. Is that correct?
That would be correct. Yeah, the easy compliance to Title IX is proportionality, strict proportionality. So yes, if football goes from 85 to 105, in my post I said that was 25. I'm a history major. Math ain't my thing. It's 20, right? Yeah. So 20 increased scholarships for football, and then you need to think about 20 increased scholarships for women's sports to comply with the strict proportionality piece of Title IX. Well, where do those 40 scholarships come from? And that's where I think from an administrative perspective, I put on my former administrative hat. The easiest answer is, well, we don't add any new scholarships. We just move scholarships so that the economic piece, right? We're talking about generally an economic flat kind of motion here. So where do those 40 scholarships come from? Well, easy pickings at the end of the day are who? Olympic sports, right?
Like if track and field on the men's side had 10 scholarships and wrestling has 10, I know 9.9 isn't exactly 10, but and I am a math guy, but we'll call it 10 for the time being. They just pull those out. Now that's a wash. they got to add 20 women's scholarships somewhere else, but then they're good. And they just cut 2 sports and they actually saved money because either one of those 2 sports are not profitable. And I think we could do a whole concept on profitability, and I'll just say it very quickly. What fans don't realize is like they look at the ticket revenue and everything else, but on the other side of it, the revenue side is the tickets and tuition. Like if you have 35 kids on a roster and you have 9.9 scholarships, you're generating 25 tuition payments, whether it's academic aid, need-based aid, student loans, out of pocket, whatever. But you have to pay a coach. You have to pay 2 or 3 assistant coaches. You have to pay a travel budget. You have to pay a recruiting budget. And you have to pay for gear. And people don't understand, like if you make a deal with the Nike or Adidas or whoever, all that gear is not free. There's a certain amount of gear that's free to the university, and it's a big, big number, but the rest of it you pay for. And you can imagine that the free stuff goes to the sports that are generating money, so they actually look more profitable.
Correct. And I think it's very easy for us at times to see the revenue numbers and forget that that's strictly revenue and it doesn't account for the expense side of things, right?
It's half the T-chart.
Yeah. Yeah. It's only half, right? And the Big Ten networks TV rights, right? Like it generates, $2.7 billion over 5 years. All right. Divide that by however many schools are in the Big Ten at this point, 37. And, all of a sudden we've got, okay, that's not that much money per year that's going to a school. That also doesn't account for all of those expenses that go alongside it. And by the way, for 40 years now, we've been in an arms race of who can best offer stuff to athletes, both as current student athletes and recruits, right? Whether it's facilities, whether it's, nutrition setups, it's all of these things that have become these like exploding arm races. It's academic support, it's what kind of shoes and gear we get, like all of these things, these expenses have gotten significant. And if you look at athletic departments across the country, I think the max we've ever seen was 8 athletic departments across the country in all sports, all divisions that are actually profitable.
Yes. And 2 things, 1 plus, 1 minus on that. Travel budget, I didn't mention, that's huge. And especially with like the Big Ten adding these California schools and then like the ACC adding like a Stanford, the travel budgets go up immensely. The other thing, and this is hard because it's a nebulous number. Like they say, well, if Matt Valenti goes to Penn, or I'll just pick another school in Pennsylvania, Penn State, 1.7, 2.3 other kids are going to come to that school just as students, not student athletes, because they want to be there. Like Alabama's been good in football for so long. And so like all these people are picking between Alabama and Auburn, and they pick Alabama because they'd rather go watch a winning team on Saturday than a losing team on Saturday. Sorry if there's any Auburn fans watching this, but I doubt it. But it's facts that there's some number to that. It's guaranteed the number is not 0. Like it has something to the popularity of the revenue generating sports. I mean, people go to KU to watch the basketball team. Like that's a given, but it's how much and how much of those kids are paying, because that is extra revenue that sport, that team is generating. But expenses are really easy to identify, and revenues are not always as easy to identify.
Absolutely true. And no offense taken on the Auburn, Alabama side of things. My college teammate's actually the co-defensive coordinator for Alabama right now. So roll tide, I'm there with you. Okay. And they're also one of the few athletic departments that's profitable, right? So, you have Alabama as one of those, but look at how many sports they offer as well, right? So, yeah, there are all these moving parts that we need to be thinking about right now. And, is there a world where wrestling just has 0 scholarships, right? And we just live in a world where we have no scholarships, but we just the costs that are covered by an athletic department end up being the actual expenses, right? The direct costs for travel and recruiting and all of those things you talked about, but there's no scholarships available. Maybe. I don't know. This is where House kind of gets funky for us, is there's this giant question mark of what the trickle down impact is at the end of the day. But the reality is athletic departments are going to have to invest more money into athletics right now. And they're going to have to strategically choose when and where that gets allocated and to whom, right? And we're going to hit this crossroads at some point of, do they want these big name sports to keep up with the Joneses? Or are they willing to continue to invest in Olympic sports? Well, history tells us that hasn't, and I'm a history major, history tells us that hasn't been the modus operandi of athletic departments throughout the years, right? They're not suddenly going to be like, you know what, football, we're just going to put you at 65 scholarships and we're going to take 20 and give them to other sports. Like, that hasn't really been how it's worked in the past. And I don't know that I foresee that being the case right now.
No, if anything, they'd give them 130. Like, they're trying to stockpile talent. The portal prevents that really from happening. Like, if you're the best quarterback in the country and I'm the third best quarterback in the country, like, you see very few Arch Manning situation where the guy's sitting, and could be starting at like 90% of the schools in the country. So Matt Bowlesby from Flow came on our pod a while back, and he pointed out something that I thought was really different, really insightful. He mentioned that, like, the SEC has a TV contract and so does the Big Ten. But he goes, the SEC has less sports. And he goes, so the revenue, he goes, you have to think about it this way. The contract is the contract. You divide it by the number of schools, and then you divide that by the number of teams. He goes, the SEC has decided they just want to be good at less sports. Like, they want to be good at softball. Like, if you look at the number of schools that are good in softball and that are in the SEC, they want to be good at baseball. You can see that. Okay. Some of it has to do with it's a warm weather sport, and most of the SEC schools are in warm weather areas, but in general, that's really important. The other thing that, like, Willie Saylor posted when the Campbell thing came out, and I like Willie a lot, and I think he's a really smart guy too, is he pointed out, like, hey, if they just got rid of Campbell's football team, they'd have all kinds of money, because that team, to use his phrase, sucks. And they're losing money too. And so, like, that's one of the tricks. Like, I live pretty close to Lindenwood University, which is doing that D2 to D1 move. And they cut men's wrestling. They kept women's wrestling. They cut men's wrestling. And then, like, their football team, they play in a nice stadium. But, like, I mean, I don't think they were on Scott Van Pelt's Bad Beats. That's the only time I've ever seen him anywhere. So, I mean, it was funny. So,
I'm with you on that one, and that's it's one of the tricky parts in all of this is football, right? And there's all these concepts floating out there right now. There are these super conferences being proposed of football Power Fours breaking away entirely. That may be good or that may be horrible. I honestly have no idea how that plays out. And if they do break away, what does that mean for all the schools that are the have-nots, and how do they then decide to approach football? It is I'd say $1 million question, but that'd be underselling. It's $1 billion question, multi-billion dollar question of what does that look like? And, is the value of making a random bowl game worth it at the end of the day? And if you can, go 500 and make a bowl game, you make the soft underpants cotton bowl at some point, like, and make $500,000 out of it. Well, that actually probably is a decent revenue add for an athletic department for a program that's making that. So there becomes this, ROI piece that athletic departments have to look at. But the point that I think you brought up that is particularly relevant is the SEC versus the Big Ten and the TV contracts. And anytime a Bowlesby's in the conversation, everybody should listen, because the Bowlesby's know what they're talking about.
They're smart guys.
They're very smart guys across the board. The whole family, they're very sharp. But yeah, I mean, you do simple math here. And again, I'm a history major, finance guy. You probably help me out here. The SEC, we'll just use round numbers, right? $10 million in TV revenue coming in for the SEC with 10 sports versus $10 million in revenue for the Big 12 coming in for 20 sports. Well, which one's going to have more money for each individual sport?
That's exactly how that's, I think, almost identically, because the math is simple. It's $500,000 versus $1 million. But that was his point, right? Like, he did it a little more detailed, like, hey, this is the contract. Like you pointed out, the contract's worth this much over 5 years. So you divide it by 5, that's how much per year. You divide it by school, that's per school. And then you divide it by sport. And if you do the same thing with the bottom line is the SEC gets more money per team. And so if you're the coach at an SEC school and I'm a coach at a Big Ten school, and we're equally good at recruiting, we're equally good at talking to kids, we're equally good at development. Our schools are 20 minutes from each other. So there's like, you hold everything constant as much as you can. You should win because you have more money. Like, your facilities should be nicer. The money should show up somewhere where kids want to go. So I think
Nope. You there?
Yeah, I just cut out for a second. The bowl game thing is really interesting because a lot of times they require the schools to buy X amount of tickets.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't buy X amount of tickets, they lose. So the school's on the hook. And if they can't resell them, they actually lose money going to the bowl game.
Mm-hmm.
So here's one of the questions I wanted to ask you on the opt-in thing. I keep seeing this number like 22 million or something like that. Is that what each school is supposed to get by opting in, or is that the money that they're supposed to have to pay out as a result of this lawsuit? What is that number?
Yeah, that projected number, from what I understand, is the revenue share money coming from the NCAA to the schools that they're paying out to athletes. Right. And so that comes back to what we were just talking about. Okay. So SEC schools with 13 sports that they offering 20 to 22 million to those athletes versus a Big Ten school that offers 35 sports with 20 to 22 million. Yeah, that number shrinks real fast when you're talking about how much those kids get at the end of the day. Right. And if you're a Big Ten school thinking about that number and trying to maximize the amount going at the sports you want to prioritize, well, if you're competing against an SEC school that has 13 sports and you have 30, it's a lot easier to make that number grow by just reducing the number of mouths you're feeding.
That's a great analogy. Like so well said, because basically if everybody wants to eat the same, you either got to cut the number of people that are eating or you got to create more food.
Yep.
And it's easier just to reduce than to increase. Like it's significantly easier to do the one over the other. And like, I remember like when it was announced USC and UCLA and Oregon and these schools were coming to the Big Ten, and people were posting like, oh, like they're all going to add wrestling. Like, what are you, crazy? Like I love people that are passionate. It drives me nuts when people lead with their heart instead of their brain when it comes. Now, listen, how you feel about something is fine, but like, trying to have intelligent dialogue is like, come on, dude. Like they're just going to add a sport that costs, like wrestling probably costs $1 million a year. When you look at a lot of these, how these work. Okay. Like you take Iowa. Like, I mean, and here's the thing people don't think about. The salaries are all public information. Like your salary is not public information because you're at a private university. Okay. But if you're at a public university, that coach is being paid by taxpayer dollars. So what David Taylor makes or Cale Sanderson makes or any of these people make is public information. So if you take the salary of one head coach, 3 assistant coaches, a total of 4, you take their recruiting budget, the travel budget of the team, all this other stuff, it's over $1 million. Now, just like you said correctly, people just see the revenue and they don't realize the other side of the column. The other column is all the negative numbers. Now, from that, you add tuition of the people that are not on scholarship. That tuition chunk goes to 0 now if these people opt into the full 30. So my question is this. What I'm hearing from a couple coaches are, look, there's no way we're opting into the 30. Like it might be better for us just to stay at 9.9, maybe get a bump to 10, just so we can say to them, don't worry about cutting us. We'll just stay where we are. And is that a school by school decision or is that a conference by conference decision? And then within that, is that a sport by sport decision? I know that's a lot of questions in one.
Yeah, those are all great questions. And the specific answer to that is not quite fully known yet. I think what I understand at this point, if a conference and all the schools associated and affiliated opt in, everybody's in. If a school opts in, all the programs then opt in. If the school
they opt in, do they have to go to the full scholarship limit then?
Well, you don't necessarily have to fund all the scholarships, but you then have to adopt the caps, and you have the opportunity to go to the full limit. So if you're at 9.9 right now, your school opts in, you may stay at 9.9 if the school allows you to stay at 9.9, right? Or you could go to 12 if you so desire.
Or they could cut you to 6 in terms of.
They cut you to 6, or they cut you to 0 because they need all 9.9
for proportionality. So I want to make sure, because we have a lot of smart people that watch us that just don't nerd out about this stuff like I do. So if you opt in as a university or a conference or whatever, you are opting into the roster cap. Like there's no working around that. Like you have to have 30 and you can't have more than 30. Is that correct?
Correct. If you opt in, you are opting into the roster cap and the revenue share as well.
Okay. But the scholarship part of it is still up to either A, the university, B, the conference. I guess that's really it. One of those two. Like,
yeah, I would say that really is just the institution, right? The school will decide how much they want to or don't want to invest into that scholarship number at the end of the day, right? There may be Alabama. We've talked about Alabama, right? We know they generate a ton of money. They might just be like, you know what? All right, if you're a part of Alabama athletic department, you're on a full ride.
Yeah, well, because they can afford it based on what you said. And you know what's interesting about the SEC schools? There's this stipend that very little people know about it, but it's called Alston money.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's about $6,000. It's $3,000 a semester. But if you're on a team, you get that. And that doesn't count against the wrestling team's 9.9.
Correct.
I mean, and then you get in all this other stuff, like how quickly can you get in-state tuition? Is your collective good? Because like the collectives that figure out a way to eliminate the NIL problem, like any of the wonkiness of it, because it's like, okay, now I donate to the collective, I get a tax credit because it's a 501c3, and then they can distribute it to the athletes.
Mm-hmm.
And then like I have coaches calling me like, hey, is there anything you can hire our kid to do? We'll pay for them. Like they have, quote, jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's making an appearance or whatever else, you know. So here's the one thing that I thought was absolutely ludicrous, but I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, I want you to correct me. The NCAA is going to hire, I've had a coach that swears this is right. I think he's crazy. That the NCAA is going to hire somebody to review all NIL deals over $600 or $1,000. I don't remember what the number was. It was a fairly low threshold. Okay. And I said to this coach, take how many sports there are. Okay. Just take the average number of sports, average number of schools. I go, just take basketball. There's 200 schools that play basketball at least. I go, and there's 10 kids on the team. I go, no, just men's basketball. I go, I think there's actually 15, but say only 10 of them get offers of some kind. I go, that's 2,000 offers. Okay. I said, a typical person works 2,000 hours in a year, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year. I said, so if they reviewed every one of those for 1 hour, which is not a very deep dive into whether or not this is legal or not, like 1 hour, you get the smartest lawyer, accountant, whatever in the world. I said, that one guy or that one woman covered men's basketball. So how many people you think they're going to hire to review all these?
So there are two pieces of the House settlement kind of floating out there that are like somewhat odd, that we're not entirely sure what they're going to look like. One of them is exactly that. This proposed, I don't believe it's a person, I think it's like an agency or division within the NCAA that reviews all of the NIL deals above a certain threshold. I agree with you. I think they underestimate how massive that will be. And that's a pretty significant undertaking. And then the other piece that kind of has been attached to House, but is not really clear yet, is there was a concept out there of the NIL collective model being brought in-house into institutions. So schools could then control the collective, which, I mean, if you ask me, that's a different lawsuit that's already in process, right? It's another incoming law settlement of some kind, which is student athlete employment, right? Now we're just talking about employing student athletes through the collective that the institution is running. That one, the judge involved in House is like, I don't really know what to do. So that one's going to have to get fleshed out a little bit more.
They're also just putting a buffer between, it's like I'm hiring you, but I don't technically, like, I don't want to be theoretically the one paying you, so I'm going to pay Bill, and then Bill's going to pay you. Like, it's just a middle person. So here's the one thing that I explained to this guy. Like, I've owned my own business since I was 22 years old, and I've made plenty of good, bad, and indifferent decisions in terms of marketing, expenditures, whatever. Okay. You cannot legislate a bad business decision. Okay. I'm older than you. So if I said, well, I want Matt Valenti, defending national champion, to do a commercial to sell cars for me. Okay. And let's say you went to the opposite of an Ivy League school and couldn't even spell car. It doesn't matter. If I want to make that decision, they can't go, well, we just don't listen. Like, you're just giving him money because you want him to wrestle for your school. Like, who are you to tell me that Matt Valenti can't sell cars? Show me the empirical data that absolutely refutes the idea that this is going to be a bad decision. And it's got to be sound, because I already get a tax credit for doing this. So if I give them 100,000, it's really only costing me 70. Okay. And here's my profit margin per car. I think I can sell 15 cars. And if I make 5,000 a car, then I'm close. Like that's impossible to legislate. And even if they say, well, like, unless you lie about in that analogy about the profitability per car, that's really the only part of it. Like, if I only make 2,000 per car, then I got to sell 35 instead of 14. But the rest of it's the same. And it's up to me to decide if I want to give you that money or not. Like, you see these guys, like, Carter Starachi's posting how big his bag was that he got and all these things. And well, I mean, I'm not posting it. He's posting it, and the numbers are floating around out there, and who knows what's true and what isn't true. And then, what some of the kids got to transfer from Arizona State to Iowa and all that stuff. But like, I originally looked at this completely the wrong way. Like, I remember when Suriano went to Michigan, I'm like, how in the hell is anybody going to get ROI on that? And you know what I realized? They don't care. These are people with, there's a street term for it I won't use. We'll just say extra income, extra assets, okay? And they want to do with it what they want to do with it. Like, maybe for somebody like you and me, like, it's a really good bottle of wine or a really expensive watch, or just you can get a Timex for $10 to tell time and you buy a $10,000 watch instead. That's your choice. You have that money. You've earned it. It's cool with your wife and family. You're not doing anything wrong. If that same person wants to give UPenn $1 million to bring all these kids over, and they're smart enough to get into school, that's their choice.
Yep. Yeah, and that's where I think that side of the house piece, and this NIL suggestion of moving it like into a more controlled setting, like, I don't see that being reality. One, the cat's already out of the bag. You're not going to get it back in. And two, to your point, I mean, if I choose to make a bad business decision and investing my money into an NIL deal with a kid but that's my choice, though. The NCAA or an institution doesn't get to determine whether I make that poor choice or not. It's my own stupid mistake to make, right? So I do agree with you on that one. I don't know that I foresee that being legislated in a significant way. I think that the other house pieces in and of themselves will cause a whole host of other things that schools will have to navigate that they won't even want to be in that world if they can help it at this point.
The toothpaste is out of the tube. Okay, like, there's no way. Like, if they go back to, theoretically, let's just say they said, okay, all wrestling teams are on 0 scholarships because of what happened with proportionality. Nobody here who is of any sort of sound mind and body believes that these kids are just going to start paying their own way. It's all just going to come from donors. And if they go, well, there's no NIL deals. Okay, well, people are going to get poker chips. I mean, that's what's going to happen. Like, they're going to find a way to pay these people. It's been going on since the 70s and 80s. Like, when OU football was paying people $600 a night to turn the light switch off in the swimming pool. Like, this is not new. I feel like it's just like the lights are on and you can see the cockroaches a lot easier. Like, it's easier to see.
Mm-hmm.
And it's perfect that the NCAA is making this promise that they're going to review all these right in the middle of political season, when everybody on both sides make promises they have no intention of keeping and are literally, in a lot of cases, almost impossible. Like, if you followed it through for 30 seconds, like, well, there's no way that person can execute that. Like, it's just impossible. Like, the amount of money they would have to pay to literally police all that. And then here's what's going to happen. They're going to go, okay, David, you can't give Matt Valenti this $100,000. Then you're just going to sue, and you're going to win because they never win. And,
Completely agree.
and you'll sue for the 100,000 plus the pain and suffering, plus the emotional damage, plus the time value of money, plus future earnings. And there's nothing in it for the NCAA. They're just going to let it go. They're just going to rubber stamp everything. So I had an argument.
I would agree.
I had an argument with the Division I head coach at a Power 4 conference, okay? And he's like, this NIL's done. I go, you're telling kids NIL is done because you don't have NIL money.
That is a likely truth.
I said to him, I go, I don't care what you're reading or whatever else. The toothpaste isn't going back in the tube. So you're telling them this because if there's no NIL money, like let's just say I'm going to count Penn as a non-Ivy League, or the Ivy Leagues are in. Everybody gets full rides. Let's just say everybody gets 30 full rides. Okay. And there's no extra money. Well, now Mirikitani University is just as appealing as Penn, minus the academic standards and accreditation and reputation and networking and all the other things that go from being a UPenn grad. But the money itself, the cash outlay is the same. And they go, you can keep your financial aid if you get any, David, like all that stuff. So it's apples to apples. But I said this to somebody and they just bust out a laugh. And I go, why are the same 8 schools always good in football? Like they got a better stadium it's people that are just, he's waving his fingers, doing the money. That's it. There's extra money. There's a reason why Arch Manning isn't leaving.
Agreed.
And it's not just because he's a team player.
Totally agree.
And these guys' numbers are publicized. Like he's got like a $2.1 million NIL deal. So I think there's a huge fallacy in this. Okay. And I brought up the fact you're a 2-time NCAA champ because I wasn't. Okay. Like I was a good high school wrestler. I mean, I won Fargo and that stuff. I just didn't do what I needed to do in college to be good. And that's a whole nother podcast and probably some deep introspection, but I didn't get it done. And you did. But I think where people make the mistake, you think differently than I do when it comes to competing and being a winner, because you were a bigger winner than I was. And that doesn't mean you're a bigger winner in life and every aspect of it. But when it came to wrestling, you pushed yourself harder. You were mentally tougher. You suffered more, there's something where you were more than me. It's just a fact. Otherwise, I'm completely delusional and just saying you're lucky. And that's crazy. That's not fair. It's not accurate. So for me to go, well, if I was mad, I would do this. You're like, bro, you don't think like me. Like, look at our resumes. You don't think like me. Just like somebody that graduated from an Ivy League school and somebody who got their GED and they go, well, I would do this. Like, well, you didn't spend all those hours in a super competitive classroom, so you don't really know. And I think all of us are like, well, if I did, I would do this. And one of the biggest, most hypocritical statements I hear is like, well, why would this kid leave? Almost everybody I know would leave their job if somebody offered them $20,000 more a year. Like if you're an accountant and you go from ABC company to XYZ company for 20 G's, they'd hop over in a minute. Someone would hop over for an extra week's vacation.
It's true. Yeah. The wrestling community, I love our community. It's a very loyal community. And I think a lot of us think loyalty in and of itself is a staying factor. But in a world where the dollar signs fly around now, loyalty only goes so far. Right. And we need to be understanding that is the reality of what we're about to walk. Well, we're already in it, but we're about to walk into it in a more in-depth and impactful way starting next year. Right. So that's coming. And while I love and appreciate the thought process of like, no, you pick that school, stay loyal to that school. Right. We've already seen it. It's only going to continue. Yeah. The toothpaste is out of the tube. NIL is not going anywhere. It's sticking around. There's other moving parts that are honestly much more significant than NIL right now that we need to be keeping eyes on that are going to impact loyalty in multiple ways, not just kids to schools, but schools to kids too. Right. So yeah, we need to be going into this eyes wide open, looking at what this landscape looks like. And I love the loyalty of our community, but loyalty is not going to keep us all alive at this point.
Well, the other thing tied to loyalty, specifically your situation, is like you're the coach in waiting. I don't know if you're the incumbent, whatever the right terminology is. I want to be completely respectful. So let's say there's one kid out of 30 that just loves Roger Reina and you and he don't have the best relationship. He might leave.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But there also might be somebody that originally wasn't going to come to Penn because they didn't enjoy the way Roger Reina recruited him. And now that you're there, they might get him. Like we saw this at Oklahoma State. Like, I don't know if John Smith recruited Sergio Vega. Okay. But David Taylor did. Brian Pearsall did. You know, same thing with Landon Robidoux. Like, and the other thing is this, which is inherently difficult. Like, I remember watching you wrestle, and you were really good, but you were also really cerebral. Like, you weren't like, in my opinion, you weren't just overtly talented and just got away with just being able to jump through the roof and run through a wall. Like, you wrestled really smart. But, like, it is really difficult to ask somebody at age 18 to make a life decision based on 5 weekends where people try to get them drunk and have a good time. Like, it's like picking who you're going to marry, you know, like based on a super shortened version of The Bachelor or something. Like, it's all emotional, and it's not, there's so many other factors to consider.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see, okay, I guess crystal ball, how do you see this going? And what can wrestling people do?
As I said in my post, I don't want to be doom and gloom, right? I don't want to be a doomsdayer. Here, I do think we may lose some programs here over the next few years. I think that's a harsh reality of what we're looking at right now. I think our coaches need to be in our administrators' offices asking weekly where their athletic department is at, how they're approaching this. What are we thinking about house? Where are we with house? I think we need to be talking to them about it all the time. Because if the answer is we don't know yet, and we keep getting that answer, be concerned.
They're putting you off. They're lying to you.
Yeah. They are making difficult decisions, and they just don't want you to tell you what those difficult decisions are, right?
They know your AD is either completely incompetent or lying to you.
Well, I will say there are a lot of schools that are trying to wait and see because they don't necessarily know what this is going to look like, and they're going to wait to see how some of the first to react, right? And I think we've seen a little bit of the first to react at this point, right? We've seen a couple of schools react a little bit, but they're not the group of 5 and they're not the power 4, right? We're waiting to see kind of how the first group reacts. Nobody wants to be the first, right? In the athletic director's world, nobody wants to be the first. No athletic director wants to drop sports. Let me put that out there. Having been on the other side, no AD goes into their job and they're like, you know what I'm really excited to do? Crush a whole bunch of kids' dreams. Like, nobody goes into their job thinking that. But they also have a responsibility to figure out how to manage an apartment financially healthfully, right? And put out a competitive product, because the number one predictor of university support, of donor giving, of fans showing up, right, is very simple. It's winning, right? When you win, more money comes in, right? That's kind of how things work. It's pretty simple. So athletic directors need to win, and they got to figure out how to do that. So when the competitive landscape changes, they have to make, at times, incredibly difficult decisions on what that means. With house, that could just mean status quo for wrestling programs. Or it could mean, we're pulling some scholarships from wrestling programs to go to other sports. Or it could mean, well, you know what? That program actually, all in, including scholarship, costs us $2.2 million a year. And we're going to have to pay out an extra $50,000 per kid per year because of this rev share. So 50 times 30, okay, another 1.5. Well, $3.5 million that we can invest in a different program. That's probably worth it, right? We'll win more in baseball if we take that 3.5 and put that into baseball instead, right? So there's any number of options of what could happen here. What athletic directors can't do is they can't touch any money that's restricted specifically for wrestling and that doesn't have an out to go anywhere else in the athletic department, right? So Notre Dame wrestling is one of the prime examples that we put out there, right? Notre Dame wrestling actually had a significant endowment years ago when they were dropped, but what they didn't have in their endowment gifts was any kind of terminology that kept that funding with the or made that funding go somewhere else if it didn't stay with the wrestling program, right? It went somewhere else. So, you're trying to figure out kind of how does that play out? What does that look like? Well, there needs to be restricted funding for wrestling, just to know that it's going to stay with the sport. If it's not restricted, you need to be nervous, right? You should be cautious about what that looks like, and you need to be asking your administrator for answers. And then from a fan and an alumni perspective, I would encourage anybody and everybody listening, give back to your favorite wrestling program. Go give some money to your program. Help support that program, because what we're going to walk into right now is a financial deficit that programs that have some healthy funding behind them that is beyond just strict, how are we doing revenue? It's going to matter. That's really going to matter. And it's going to make a difference in what an athletic director looks at when they go into this new world.
And when those people are donating, they need to earmark it's like, this is only for the wrestling program. I'm only supporting the university because of wrestling. The Notre Dame one's interesting to me because it hit home, because it's one of the schools I was actually recruited by.
Mm-hmm.
It tells you how old I am. But so I also think that, like, it points out that, like you said, if they don't restrict things, like, people just plug that over into basketball or baseball or, badminton or wherever else. So
I totally agree. And that's something we need to keep a close eye on as we're kind of looking into the future here, because it's going to be challenging.
Well, let's finish this on a positive note. You guys are one of the host school, I believe, for the NCAA Nationals in March.
We're co-hosts alongside Drexel.
Drexel, yeah. So I got a chance to talk to you off air. We're actually going to bring Border Brawl up there. It'll be under a different name. We're super excited about that. But the energy of the people I'm talking to in the Philadelphia area, got a chance to talk to Kevin McGuigan, who I know you're really close with. They reach out to Roger Reyna, Beat the Streets Philadelphia, the National Preps, the Wrestling and Business Network up there. I've been talking to all those guys. I know they're working on getting a fan fest worked out. I've been talking to Matt Gilbert at Resolite. And as somebody who lives in the city that's hosted it more than anybody, it's cool to see the energy level of Philly, of the Philly area, the collective Philly area, that people are really excited about it and really want to put their best foot forward. And certainly from a wrestling perspective, Pennsylvania, if it's not the best state in the country in wrestling, is on the very, very short list, depending on your criteria. But, in terms of high school excellence and number of All-Americans, number of college programs, D1, D2, all the way down the line, it's exciting. So we will finish on that positive note. I appreciate you so much for coming on. Appreciate you letting me interject a few thoughts with you. I know we just want people to understand a little better. And maybe hey, here's the golden goose thing. But I think, like, these coaches also need to understand, like, $400,000 and $500,000 coaching salaries may not be lasting much longer if you don't generate revenue. Like, that's kind of like, when you own your own business, it's pretty easy. You eat what you kill. And if you don't generate that, one of my favorite sayings a guy told me once in his life, he goes, you're either revenue or you're overhead. And if you're not sure which one you are, you're overhead.
I think that is a perfect thing to think about as we talk about where we're going from here. And that is exactly how anybody involved in the sport of wrestling should be thinking about where we're going right now, right? Is if you aren't involved in the revenue side, then you are overhead. And if you are overhead, you need to be thinking long and hard about how you become revenue, right? And that is the immediate, like, what we need to be thinking about. And coaches, everybody out there, like, this needs to be an eyes wide open moment where we're paying very close attention to how this all plays out, because it's coming really fast and we need to be ready.
Yeah, I'll say this, like, I saw Chris Pendleton on Flow saying that the duel they had last year was like the biggest revenue generator on campus besides a football game, or the biggest one in Gill Arena, or whatever the right term is. And, like, they said to him, how'd you do it? Can you do it again? And can you do it twice? And I think they have Iowa and Oklahoma State coming out there like 14 days apart. That's somebody who understands, look, there's more to it than just us winning wrestling matches.
Totally agree.
Like, if you take 17th, but you have the two biggest generating events, that's probably better for the school than if you take 12th without those. Because I don't think the amount of donors are going to be that different on 10 extra team points, which is probably what that is.
Great point. Absolutely. Yeah.
I love talking to smart people. I really appreciate you giving me an hour, man. I'll probably be in touch with you soon about this other event that I talked to you about offline. And we appreciate everybody watching and listening. Thank you guys so much. We'll speak to y'all next week.